Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this 9th in the series of our Food GRP webinars. My name is Beat Kümin. I'm one of the academic leads for the Food GRP, looking after its food and drink cultures theme, and otherwise based in Warwick's Department of History. The Food GRP is one of Warwick's 10 interdisciplinary global research priorities. These clusters support cross-faculty collaboration and outreach, enabling Warwick researchers to work together with external scholars and engage with a wider public. Our Food GRP has 3 main themes: healthy food, food security, and food and drink cultures. We base much of our activity around these themes, but are also open to other ideas and opportunities around food. This term, we're particularly proud to run the feast theme for the Resonate Festival, which Warwick University contributes to Coventry, UK City of Culture 2021. In November and December, that is in a few weeks' time, we will run a series of events and initiatives, among which a feast food festival, linking food and drinks producers and restaurants from the region with researchers from the university. We're also going to stage an antique Greek-Roman cooking feast and a modern-day church ale in collaboration with the parish of Berkswell and the Warwick Network for Parish Research. For further information on how to take part, please visit our website at an address which I will put into the chat shortly. Today is my special commissioned webinar, which is very much aligned with this feast theme, and I'm delighted to welcome Sara Pennell, who is Associate Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Greenwich, as well as co-director of the Summer University and Food and Drink Studies run by the European Institute for the History and Cultures of Food at Tours in France. She has researched and written on manuscript recipe collections, potatoes and chocolate, as well as early modern perceptions of diet. Her monograph on the birth of the English kitchen, 1600 to 1850, is available from Bloomsbury, and she's currently preparing a book about one of England's foremost early modern writers of recipes, Hannah Woolley. There will be an opportunity to ask questions and make comments in part 2 of the webinar. If you'd like to contribute, just raise your hand by the symbol at the top of your screen or by writing your question in the chat. So I'm very much looking forward to Sara's talk, and I'll leave the floor to her.
Thanks very much, Beat, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure, firstly, to be able to take a bit of time out from the trials and tribulations and crises of a teaching term to think about one's own research. And also it's an even greater pleasure because I can see in the audience one of the people whom I can sort of thank for enabling me to think about this project through the connection that University of Greenwich has with Charlton House in Southeast London, and Meg Cable, who is one of the team that I work with on student projects and work placements and so on, is very much part of, has enabled me to think about this manuscript and the space at Charlton that it's not evidence to be connected with, but which I think we can imagine a connection with. So I'm going to share my screen now. So how this came about, I think it's worth saying that as with all sort of incipient research, it depends on some luck, some sort of coming together of material that one might not have previously known existed, alongside, as I say, collaborations that one is involved in for other reasons. So this this research came about through trying to establish a student placement with Charlton House, which is a Jacobean mansion in southeast London, run by the Royal Greenwich Heritage Trust. And in discussing the various projects and research themes that Meg and her colleague Carolyn Ayres were interested in researching was the summer house. And we'll come on to the summer house in a minute. My interest, of course, is in food and particularly in 16th, 17th and early 18th century food through the medium of recipe collections, but also material cultures of food. And I wanted to see if I could get a student interested in manuscript recipe books. Yes, please, let's get them all into manuscript recipe books. So in doing that, I was idly searching Stephen Schmidt, who's also in the audience's wonderful website, Manuscript Recipes, and came across a manuscript that I did not know about. Now, that's always a bit embarrassing when you call yourself a historian of manuscript recipe collections, but Stephen's website is encyclopedic in its coverage, and thankfully brought me into to meet this manuscript. So this is a manuscript recipe collection now in the collection of the Lilly Library in at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, and it is associated with Henry, Prince of Wales, thanks to the gilt-stamped heraldic device of the prince on the front and back covers. It's about 32 centimetres long, so a sort of quarto size. It's bound in contemporary cloth, so the binding is contemporary, and it's part of the Gerson cookery book collection, about which I know very little, but I suspect, like many late 19th, early 20th century collectors of cookery books, there's a very great interest in those manuscripts and printed books that could be connected with named individuals. So this is manuscript. Now, just because it has, and this is, I'm sure if there are book historians amongst you, just because it has the heraldic device of Prince Henry on it doesn't mean to say it was part of his library. And I think what would need to be done is further investigation of other bindings that are associated with Henry, Prince of Wales, any of his surviving books, to see whether this sort of quality of binding, and it isn't the best quality, would link it to actually being a volume that was in his collection, or instead it was a volume that might have been presented to the prince or his household, or in case of the person we're about to meet, Sir Adam Newton, his tutor, in search of patronage or in search of some other form of connection and indeed even employment. You too can access the manuscript itself, all 471 pages of it, because it has been fully digitized by the Lilly Library, and some of the images I am using today come from that digitization. Now, for those of you who may not know what a manuscript recipe book is, I'm sure most of you in the audience do, but it's a handwritten, i.e. not printed, collection of recipes, and these were extremely popular to produce in elite and gentry households in really from the middle to late 16th century onwards, and indeed obviously many of you probably have relatives who collected recipes in their own way in the early 20th and through to now, either by clipping recipes from magazines or whatever. But these early modern examples of recipe collections have become very important documents to study for a variety of reasons. Partly, if they are associated with women, they form one of the few sources of writing by women in particularly the late 16th and 17th centuries, outside of the very small number of women who engaged in forms of published writing. But they're also an incredible source for things like the history of medicine. So Sir Henry Wellcome, who collected recipe books in vast number, was interested in their medical content. And this manuscript also has, as its final section before the element I'm going to talk about today, quite an extensive selection of what are termed chirurgical recipes, so medicinal recipes, mainly of to deal with external complaints, so plasters and ointments and so on. So recipe books aren't just about cookery, they can be about medicine, they can be about household preparations, polishes and the like, washing balls, but they can also be quite specialised, and I would suggest, following on from Stephen Schmidt, that this is a very specialised book, and it has obviously therefore been structured in a particular way for a particular purpose. Hence, I'm interested in the whole presentation idea for someone seeking patronage. So it contains none of the organisational tools or paratext, for example, a title page or a table of contents, which one might find in other recipe books. A good example of this, contemporary to this example, is the 1606 dated manuscripts, one copy in the Folger, one copy in the Wellcome, of the recipes of Mrs. Corlyon, which are very much presentation copies, and possibly if someone's seeking the patronage of one copy went to the Countess of Arundel. This book, the Prince Henry, for want of a better term of calling it, comprises mainly confectionery and sweetmeat recipes. What I'm going to go on to term the banqueting stuff. Particularly preserves, conserves, marmalades. I know this is sounding like your jam cupboard, but stick with me. Dried fruits and seeds, jellies, and within the section on bake meats, biscuits in the French, Italian and Spanish manner. There's also a section on jellies and on cookery, which includes various tarts and meat dishes and so on. And as I said, it concludes with the sizable selection of chirurgical recipes. So, in some ways that makes it like other examples of the genre, but what makes this one stand out is in its final few pages before, there's a section of 30 blank leaves at the back of the volume, but there are these 4 pages and snaps to the Lilly Library for their best holding down manicule, silver manicule pointer. In the final 4 leaves of the manuscript, there is a 4-page section headed "Several sorts of sweetmeats fitting for a banquet." It's part menu, part shopping list, part set of directions. Now, while many of the preceding recipes seem to be copied directly from or adapted from contemporary texts, for example, from St. Thomas Dawson's The Good Housewife's Jewel of 1596, in this manuscript there's a verbatim copy of the directions for making plates and cups and so on out of sugar plate. The anonymous A Closet for Ladies and Gentlewomen from 1608, and Sir Hugh Platt's Delights for Ladies of 1609. In my understanding, this listing is unique in its specificity, as well as its details about the costs of certain items and what ancillary items should be sourced, and in one instance, where from. Now we're going to return to this list in just a moment. Let's just briefly encounter the tragic Prince Henry. So Prince Henry, for those of you who are unfamiliar with his story, was the eldest son of James VI of Scotland and first of England. He was born while his father was still only King of Scotland in 1594. And because James and his wife Anne were fairly fecund, he was followed by several other children, including a spare, Charles, and various daughters. So Henry was raised to be his father's heir. And in 1603, when James VI becomes James I of England and a sort of Great Britain, Henry is then becomes the heir to a much larger constellation of kingdoms. He was a very model of a late Renaissance prince. He was incredibly well educated by the man that we will encounter in a minute, very cultured, extremely well read, an avid and tasteful collector of European art and artifacts, and as we can see from this absolutely stunning Oliver miniature, not so miniature, it's actually quite sizable, from the Royal Collection. He was he was being molded to be the next monarch of Great Britain. In 1610, he is created Prince of Wales, and this miniature may be in commemoration of that event. Unfortunately, and this is so often the way with early modern princes, he fell ill in 1612 and died rather suddenly of typhoid fever at Richmond Palace, plunging the royal family into despair and despondency, and to some degree the nation too. Remember, this is a fairly new dynasty, all sorts of, sort of politicking behind the scenes, and Charles, his younger brother, then becomes heir to the throne, having not really been prepared for it, and who knows how far that explains what happens some 25 years later, and when he ends up having his head cut off in 1649. Henry was, as I said, very well educated, and he was well educated by the man who lived in this house. So this is Charlton House, which was built between circa 1607 and 1612. I do urge you to visit. It's free to visit, and it is a really interesting example of a house that has been in the 20th century, been under local authority care, and now in the care of the not-for-profit Royal Greenwich Heritage Trust. So Charlton was built for Sir Adam Newton, who dies in 1630, who was of humble Scottish birth, like many of James's courtiers and hangers-on, but he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, becoming a scholar, a professor of laws, and then in 1599 was selected to become Prince Henry's tutor. This was a very plum position, to be tutor to the heir to the throne. You are schooling the young gentleman in the ways of being a monarch, of being a good and just ruler, but also in the requirements of being a erudite and wise monarch as well. This brought Newton prestige and wealth. And so in 1607, Newton purchased the manor of Charlton for the sizable sum of £4,500. Now, using the wonderful National Archives currency converter, we know that that's just over £600,000 in around 2000. So it doesn't seem a lot of money, but it was in that time. So Charlton was completed in about 1612 and was described by a visitor or a historian of Kent in the 1650s as a, quote, goodly brave house. Now, no architect has been definitively connected with the house, like many Jacobean houses built in the environs of London at the time. Ham House, Eagle House in Wimbledon, oh gosh, there's another house, a Brentford house. John Thorpe's name has been connected with the design and building, but the 2016 World Monuments Fund study by Lily Higgins suggests that a drawing which exists in Sir John Soane Museum's volume of Thorpe drawings appears to be a plan survey rather than a design for the house, so after the fact rather than before the construction. Unfortunately, very little is known about Newton's occupancy of the house he built or how such a suburban elite house was used. Nonetheless, given James I's enjoyment of Greenwich Palace as one of the many he frequented, it was an appropriately located property for accessing the royal court when in residence there. And of course, the river provides easy access to the city and Westminster beyond. The quality of the interiors, although the house has been much altered by subsequent owners and occupants and badly damaged in World War II by a V2 rocket. So this side, the north wing, is pretty much a full reconstruction after World War II, because the V2 landed over here. And you can see that in the different colour of the bricks. So the house entered into the ownership of the Marion Wilson family in the late 18th century, and they made a lot of improvements and additions over the time that they occupied the house until 1928. Correct me if I'm wrong, Meg, when the property was and the contents were sold. Even though, despite those alterations, the design of the house, its spaces within, suggest it was not merely a retreat, but a place for the business and entertainment of a courtier. As Maurice Howard also suggests, for a man even of the lowly birth of Adam Newton, he was a man of erudition. Some of his library ends up in Trinity College, Cambridge, and some of whose paintings were purchased by Sir Lionel Cranfield of Knowle in Kent. Such houses were also, and I'm quoting Maurice Howard here, carapaces for collections. So they were exhibition spaces as well as spaces for commensality, for performing patronage, and so on. It's not a country house in the sort of, traditional sense of it being a landed estate, although its grounds did supply some produce and so on for the household. Prince Henry's connections with Charlton House are also very sketchy, although Newton remained by his side once he set up his own household on his elevation to being Prince of Wales in 1610. After Henry's premature death in 1612, Newton was one of the few of his household to be, if you like, moved over to the household of the new Prince of Wales, Charles, as his financial receiver. Newton died in 1630, at which point the house at Charlton and the contents passed to his only son, Henry. Now, Henry is not Henry Newton, he is by this time Henry Puckering, because he's changed his name in order to inherit a more valuable estate via his mother. And then in the estate is then sold in its entirety in the 1650s, and it goes through a succession of owners until the Marion Wilsons in the late 18th century. Okay, so what is this? Why am I going on about Charlton, and why am I? How do I connect it to the manuscript? Well, I'm going to go back to the manuscript first, and if I can shift their things. So what I've done over the next few slides is just taking a look at what it contains and what it is telling us about a banquet. Now, some of you I know exactly what I mean by the term banquet. It is a problematic term in food history because it has a number of different meanings. So when I am talking about a banquet, I am talking about the specific concluding element of an elite food event in from the 16th and 17th centuries, which comprises items that are mostly sweet, usually highly spiced and perfumed, and which are intended to be a form of digestive. So they have say a therapeutic value as well as being tasty. So it's a sort of, when we eat after 8 mint or a Bendix bitter mint after, you know, a large meal, and perhaps drink a liqueur, you are sort of summoning up the ghosts of the Jacobean banquet. Although, as we know, both of those things are less than healthy for us in excess. So the banquet was a form of food event that was very tailored to a specific set of foodstuffs and a specific experience. And that experience was often away from where the main dining event had taken place, in a separate space, either a temporary space or, as we shall see, a permanent space. And it was also equipped with its own material cultures. Many people have written about the banquet as a material event as well as a food event. Most recently, Louise Stewart in her article in the Historical Journal of 2018. Also Victoria Jackson with her work on Jacobean trenches, and indeed back in the 1990s, the collection by C. Ann Wilson out of the Leeds Food Symposium called Banqueting Stuff, and I am indebted to all of those works as well as other writings on the role of the banquet. So what do we see in this particular list of several sorts of sweetmeats fitting for a banquet? What I'm suggesting is that it is both a, an idealized, this is what you could serve forth in your banquet, but it's also perhaps thinking about a specific event, and it is tethered in time to the specifics of some of the economics of the banquet, as well as to the wider economics and circulation of goods transnationally. Of course, we'll talk about sugar in a minute. So at the head of the list, underneath the title segment, is one great marchpane with a very high conceit, made by hand of marchpane stuff, 2 other marchpanes with the middles of cast works, and very well set forth with conceit. So the directions begin with a centerpiece of the event, a marchpane made of a sugared almond, a paste made of almonds and sugar, which is made by hand. Marchpane is not quite the same as marzipan, but similar. marchpane could be rolled into wafer-thin discs, which were then decorated with other sweet decorations. So sugar plate work, as in the other two marchpanes mentioned here, so the conceits, sugar plate lozenges, castings, gilding, comfits, and so on. But here, the central great marchpane was to be hand moulded from the paste itself in a high conceit. It might be gilded, coloured with floral and mineral derived food colourings, a few of which are mentioned towards the end of this list, and garnished with other sweetmeats, such as comfits, biscuit nuts, and so on. And those of you who remember the silver balls, the sugar flowers, and the jellied diamonds that used to decorate the birthday cakes of yore before we all got very fashionable and had to have Italian meringue or whatever, these are the much more mundane descendants of this manuscript's conceits. Now, conceit carries more than just the meaning of fancy decoration here. It alludes to the playful, curious, and wondrous. The banquet conceit was more than just a piece of complex sugarcraft. It was a form intended to delight the eye, provoke curiosity and conversation, and declare the wonder of the artifice involved in this great marchpane. So we're seeing a lot of artifice and artificial skill in the creation of these marchpanes. Louise Stewart, who's gone through the through various Elizabethan Jacobean household accounts with a fine tooth comb, has found references to marchpane, sculptures, as it were, being presented to the Queen in New Year's gifts, and commissioned for very special banquets. So, for example, at Elveston in 1590 something. So they are, part of the visual stimulus of this event. Next, in the green rectangle, we have the passe de jaune, including plums de jaune, dried gourd, candied eringa root, and dried apricots. So these are the dried fruit pastes, although not just pastes, these are also dried fruits in and of themselves. Candied eringa root is the root of the eringo, candied as in a peel. So these are one component where we can see the sugar and the fruit element, and indeed the those fruits are perhaps a little bit more difficult to get hold of. You will see here dried potatoes. Now that doesn't sound too appetizing, but when we think of this being a sweet potato rather than Virginia potato, candying potato was a recipe that one can find in some of those early Jacobean confectionery texts, and is also, obviously, there's a descendant in the candied yam of the Thanksgiving table. Okay, next we have the dried suckets sucket of several sorts, including oranges yellow, pom citheroons, and green peaches. Now, citheroons I read as citron. That is the sort of slightly more the older relative of the lemon, very dimpled, large skin. If you know anything about the Jewish festival of Sukkot, you might know it as the etrog. And I think it's interesting that you can see in the Latin name of the citron, Citrus medica, again, that connection to these ingredients having some therapeutic component to them. So these suckets are these dried suckets. You can have wet suckets and dried suckets. These dried suckets are very analogous to what we would now call candied peel. So particularly your green lemons and the citron. Section 3 in the yellow, we have the rock candies of several sorts, including rock candied marigold flowers and rock candied borage and bugloss flowers, rock candied cloves, and rock candied almonds. You can see here the range of things that you could rock candy, as it were. And earlier in the confectionery sections of the manuscript, we have a recipe to rough candy all kinds of flowers, fruits, and spices with a clear rock candy. And I reproduced the recipe. Sorry about the quality of the reproduction on the left. And I'll just read this out for you. Take any of these aforesaid being preserved and dried again, or any kind of paste being dried. Lay all these things upon round wires in an earthen pan. When you have laid one wire full, put another upon that in like manner. May you lay 4 or 5 wires in one pot. Then take as much clarified sugar as will fill your pot being boiled to a candy height. Then put on your top wire and set in a chimney corner upon a cushion and cover it with a blanket, and there let it remain 6 or 7 hours. Then take it up and let all the sugar that will come from it run into a basin, and so let it stand edge-long, dropping fur. I think it's fur, so sort of like, you know, hairs, of before the fire, for that doth fasten the candy upon it. Then take up the wires, and all your things will be as clear as a crystal. Now, this is I wanted to reproduce this and transcribe it to give you a sense of the detail in the recipe. It's like nearly all the recipes for the confectionery elements in this manuscript. It's very descriptive. It's very it's not just about the process, but it's also about the equipment you will need, the timings, and what the finished item should look like. And this is one of the less lengthy recipes in the collection. It is incredibly detailed, and in fact, in some respects, some of the components that have connection with printed recipe collections, the 3 I mentioned earlier on, are the detail in the manuscript is much more than in the printed book. So it's interesting to think about where these recipes may have come from and what their relationship is with sort of similar printed variants. Okay, on the next folio we have the dried pastes of several sorts, including paste of quinces white, paste of pippins, paste of violets. Now these are more like the sort of membrillo type paste that you might be familiar with, dominated by fruits, although not all entirely familiar perhaps nowadays, such as barberries and the paste of violets, for example. Next, although without any detail, we just have jellies of several colours, but we'll come back to another detail about the jellies of several colours in a minute. Then, what I called section 5 in orange, we have perhaps the biscuits, French macaroons, genetaires or gentilices. I'll show you the recipe for that in a minute. Prince Biscuit, Naples Biscuit, conceits of marchpane stuff, and sugar plates. So these are the sort of baked components, although also we're looking here at the other smaller modelled marchpane stuff, perhaps the letters, the knots that we see in paintings like Clara Peter's wonderful early 17th century still lives, and sugar plate decorations made out of hard sugar plates, of sugar boiled to usually called Manuscript height, and then set as plates that can be or set in molds that can then be they can be released from and used as decoration. Section 6 in the purple is all sorts of comfits, including almond comfits, cinnamon and ginger comfits, and ambergris comfits, and red and white muscadines. Now, these are the components in this list which have induced me to call this a shopping list, because these are all set at a price. So we have the almond, coriander, aniseed, and biscuit and caraways, all at 16 pence, presumably the ounce, but I would need to go and have a look at contemporary account books just to check that. Cinnamon comfits and ginger and orange comfits and so on at 20 pence, and then the ambergris, nutmeg and the muscadines all at 4 shillings. Elsewhere in the manuscript, there is a recipe for making caraway comfits as if from a comfit maker. Clearly these are parts of this banqueting setup that it's deemed easier to go and buy them, you know, so ready-made, rather than engaging in the very laborious process of covering your seeds, your tiny aniseeds or coriander seeds, in layer upon layer upon layer of setting sugar syrup. Any of you who may have watched the series of programs by Annie Gray on the baker, you know, the bakers across time, in the first episode they have a go at making comfits and the sort of length of time it takes to get those layers and layers of hardened sugar to set on the seeds. It's very time consuming. In our yellow, we have all sorts of conceits, so comfits followed by conceits, including walnuts, apples, herring, lobsters and radishes. And as you read that list, you think, why on earth would you have lobsters on the table with all this sweet stuff? Then, of course, at the bottom, we have the explanation, all these to be made of sugar. So these are your artificial imitations of these. So artificial walnuts, artificial almonds, artificial herring, and artificial lobsters. So moulded and coloured to appear as if they were those things. And I'm interested in the inclusion here of the sprat, the herring and the lobster. Makes me think of some of the Lord Mayor's Day feast materials from the 17th century that I've been lucky to look at, where you have the Lord Mayor's Day feast falling on a fast or a fish day, and therefore you have no meat, just fish in those dinners or feasts. And I wonder whether this is referring, these are signify that this is a banquet, you know, for an event to be held on a fish or fasting day. And then finally on this leaf folio, and continuing over onto the next, we have the preserves of diverse sorts. So these are called preserved fruits, preserved in sugar syrup, all sorts of fruits and vegetables, fruits rather, and so on. Now, as I say, many of these items have accompanying recipes earlier in the manuscript. I'm just given here the recipes to make the Prince Biscuit and to make what in the recipe are called gentilices, and these are sort of baked biscuits using sugar, almonds, in the case of Prince Biscuit, flour, and this incredibly popular part of the banqueting array of foodstuffs. And I love that the recipe for gentlest concludes with, they will be as white as snow and as light as a puff. It's very, almost Mary Berry in its aspirations. But it's these are very, as I say, very detailed recipes in terms of the process and what you need to get. So, for example, here we have the aforesaid double refined sugar, gum dragon, the white of a new laid egg, so on. It's not that other recipe books or other recipes of this sort aren't always as detailed, but this, I get the sense from these that they are somebody who really knows what they're doing. Okay, on the third folio we have the continuation up here of the preserves, followed by, in orange, a very short section of marmalets of quinces and marmalette of pippins, followed by wafers. Marmalets, again, you know, they're not marmalade in any modern sense. They are these very sugar-rich pastes made from the juice of the cooked quinces or the cooked apples, and then boiled down to make this jelly-like substance. Wafers, I hope wafers are fairly obvious, but the image that I will end with will show those again. Then we have a section which is more about equipment and about ingredients, and again about process. So this is the section in green, and it's basically what you're going to need. You're going to need glass plates and glass bowls. Then, helpfully, it gives you the names of the sugars which it's best to preserve, to candy, and to make pastes. Brazil powder, sugar, Madeira or Berbera, i.e. Madeira or Barbary sugars, is best to preserve. Double refined sugar is best for pastes and rough candy. If you will not go to the price, sorry about the spelling mistake there, of double, single will serve. So that's about the level of refining that the sugar has gone through. And of course, double refined is more expensive than single. Gum dragon, gum tragacanth, you may buy for 4p an ounce. Raspberries for 6p. And then we have the colours. Bis blue is a good assa, or rather azure colour. Saffron for yellow, and sap is green is best for green. So here again we have some advice, as if to the imagined maker, but we're also here having that glimpse into what is a transitional period in the supply of what underpins this entire event, sugar. We have no mention here of sugar from the Caribbean. We have Brazil powder sugar, some New World sugar coming via the Iberian colonies, and Madeira or Barbary sugar, so the old world sugar production in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic islands. And we're at that point at the production or the writing of this manuscript where the plantation of sugarcane into the Caribbean has yet to take place on any scale, or with any impact on the English market for sugar. We also have some of the useful colours and the sort of pricing, which again, with a little bit more research, could pin us down in time and place in terms of the cost of these specific ingredients. Then right at the bottom of the page, we've got the yellow section, which is chemical, wonderful spelling, oils, is best to season your jellies. So going back to the jellies of many colours, we've got seasoning, i.e. flavouring, but also smell, the odour of these jellies through these very powerful distillations of oils of cinnamon, mace and cloves, which are deemed necessary for seasoning crystal jelly withal. So the banquet is a multi-sensory experience. It's not just about the look, it's not just about the taste, it's also about the smell, and the you know, the combined sensual nature of the consumption. And then I'm really sorry about the quality of this image, but I promise you at the top we have the continuation of the chemical oils, the oils of nutmeg, the oils of mace, oils of cinnamon and oil of cloves, all these necessary to season crystal jelly. Then the next and final section of this list gives again 2 prices for types of gold leaf: party gold at 8p a book and fine gold at 16p a book. And then the most intriguing perhaps part of all these necessaries you may buy at the Sign of the George at the Stock in London. Now, by stock, I have assumed that this means the stocks market, a thriving produce market in the city at the foot of Cornhill, basically where the Mansion House is now, for those of you who know London, and illustrated here for its meat and fish market sellers in Hugh Alley's A Caveat for the City of London, from 1598, the manuscript held at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Now, although it was predominantly a fresh produce market, it also, any market of that nature usually also attracts in its orbit other sellers and likewise grocers and other provendors of foodstuffs. So one imagines that whoever was retailing at the Sign of the George was probably either a grocer, an apothecary of some sort, or somebody who was themselves a comfit maker or confectioner. I want to take us back finally to Charlton House, and we're not in the main house now. We're at this fabulous little building, the Summer House, or prospect room, or banqueting room, or house. Why am I bringing this here? Well, this structure stands to the northwest of the house, and is, I think it's fair to say, still a bit of a conundrum, and yet there are many interesting, sort of possible connections that it has. Its origins are unclear, although it is popularly attributed to Inigo Jones, the premier classicising architect of the Jacobean era, and of course the architect of both the Queen's House in Greenwich itself and the Whitehall Palace Banqueting House. There are obviously classicising details here. The flat columns on the front, very strange roof line, and then the door, and I'll show you a similar door in a minute. It's slightly on the rise. It has a little prominence, and if one were to be looking out of these windows that way down, you would have the most amazing view, or you would have had in the early 17th century. Development and trees have got in the way. So we can see here on the Roke map of 1746, we can see there's the Charlton House here, and this is the structure just talking about. This is St Luke's Church, which was also built by Sir Adam Newton. And why have I also used the term possibly it's a prospect room? Well, because if you were to look down the valley, as it were, so Charlton does indeed stand on an eminence, and if you were to look down the valley, you would be looking really pretty much straight at Greenwich Palace, as was on the site of the Royal Hospital, and to the river and onwards towards the city and Old St Paul's. So it is at once a space that could be used for a variety of purposes. It's mentioned in a later, so there is no evidence, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. There is no evidence amongst Jones's extensive archive that this was indeed a building of his design. And if I go back, as the caption here suggests, there is a general understanding that it's from either the era of Henry Puckering, so Sir Adam Newton's son's occupancy of the house in the 1630s, again with little underpinning evidence, or from the occupancy of the house by Sir William Ducie from 1659. Ducie was an East India merchant. Charlton was at some point in the first half of the 17th century equipped with a wide range of service and other outbuildings. So in the 1679 schedule of possessions of Sir William Ducie, that later occupant of Charlton, there's a still house, a dairy, a bakehouse, an evidence room, as well as a listing for a banqueting house, which at that point contained a marble table and 6 gilded wooden chairs and 3 rollers, possibly garden rollers, all valued at £3. Ducie's schedule calls it a banqueting house, but it may also be, as I suggested, a prospect room, which is one of the terms used for William Cecil's rooftop banqueting houses at Tybalt's, using its location to provide views across the surrounding landscape. Another possibility is it could have been conceived of as a pranketing house, an example of which is documented at Tart Hall, the Countess of Arundel's house in London in 1641. And a pranketing house is a kind of, mash-up of a banqueting house, but also a display room for your cabinet of curiosities or your exotic ceramics and so on. So it's a place of display as well as commensality and performance on the banquet table, as it were. Whatever its original conception, for both Newton and other new minted courtiers, performative spaces like banqueting houses were a crucial component of their self-fashioning. As Louise Stewart notes in her 2018 article, for such men, and I'm quoting her here, the banquet was effective in signalling elite separateness because it gave its participants opportunities to perform their status and belonging to an exclusive group. So it's a tool to use in that creation of your elite identity. But Stewart goes on to argue that at the time in the 1610s and 1620s, where we have what has sometimes been called the mushrooming elite, those baronets and gentry who are elevated to landed titles by James, we have a certain anxiety perhaps amongst those men about their status, and their houses and the attributes of their houses are ways in which they can assert their right to belong to these elevated groups. And the banqueting house in particular, as Stewart also points out, is a really, boutique space in which to access elite forms of education. So in the sort of discussions and the decorations of banqueting houses, often using classicizing and mythical motifs, the practice of good government, and awareness of the pan-European culture of revived antiquity and refined manners. Now, I think one of the reasons why the Charlton banqueting house, Charlton summer house has not been perhaps conceived of as banqueting houses. It doesn't look like the ones from the 16th century, for example, the laycock, octagonal tower houses and so on. But I think we do need to keep in mind that in the early 17th century, different designs and different houses which no longer stand were also erected with these multiple purposes. And I'm put on the screen here John Aubrey's description of Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam's banqueting houses at his house in Gorhambury near St Albans. And I just think this description also fits fits possibly what the interior as well as the exterior of the Charlton House, of course built from London brick rather than stone, as in the example here on the right, which some of you may know because you may have stayed in it as a landmark trust house, the 1613 East Banqueting House at Chipping Camden, on the site of the now disappeared Old Camden House. Sir Baptist Hicks, who is another of James's sort of mushrooming courtiers, basically his banker, he builds these in around 1613. And although this picture is really rubbish, the door frame is very similar to, and the wooden door, it's very similar to the Charlton door and door frame. So I think we can look at some of these surviving and also the descriptions of now lost banqueting houses and think about a particularly Jacobean house style banqueting house rather than a rooftop turret or so on, that could serve these multiple purposes, not just solely for banqueting, but perhaps also for the view element and also for the display of certain collections.
Sarah, we just have to keep an eye on time, please, so that we have a
right now.
Good. Excellent.
So, how then might we bring this to life in a property like Charlton? Now, without wishing to diminish its interest, it does lack many of the attributes of historic houses of the same era, like Ham House, for example. It has no original furniture, and that extensive remodelling across subsequent centuries, as well as a recent history of constraints of local authority care and make use of resources like the Prince Henry banquet manuscript and the space of the summer house, perhaps a bit more constrained than were we in a National Trust property. It's a live issue for Charlton because the summer house has attracted successful funding for conservation interventions and has been the subject of historical and archaeological investigations in the past 2 years on the behalf of the Trust. Carolyn Ayres and Meg Cable would like to interpret the space appropriately, but I think it's fair to say, Meg, you don't have access to the sorts of funds that enabled the curators of the 2020 Feast and Fast exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum to commission Ivan Day, known to many of you as the premier specialist in recreating Renaissance and early modern foodstuffs and tablescapes, such as the one pictured here. So I want to suggest some smaller scale ways in which one might use the foodstuffs creatively from the manuscript and the space in creative and interactive ways. Firstly, of course, banqueting stuff is intriguing to visitors, especially in terms of the conceit aspect and the playfulness and the artificiality, but it's also surprisingly durable in terms of show and tell usage. The marchpane bacon and eggs down here in the red, I've circled here, are witty and relatively easy to make with modern marzipan and natural food colourings, but enable discussion of the playfulness of the banqueting table. The wafers could be made in advance and the designs imprinted on them discussed in relation to the classical and biblical themes that subdues the Jacobean banquet, the decoration of the banqueting hall, which you perhaps cannot hope to recreate, and the symposium style of conversation and exchange. While sugar plate is best made by a professional, one such model, perhaps even of the summer house itself, could link the banquet to that its foundation ingredient, sugar, and also to the wider landscape of the consequences of the colonization of the Caribbean as a sugar producing realm for early modern England. Greenwich, with its easy access to the docksides that were beginning to see cargoes of New World commodities along with Asian ceramics and spices, enabled residents of houses like Charlton to be aware of such goods ahead of other groups and to be informed as to how to get them and where to shop in the city to secure them for the best prices. The parochial registers of St Alfred's Church, no doubt the records of St Luke's as well, saw the recording of adult baptisms of Black African servants to the area's merchants and traders, another connection that could be made between the banqueting table and the local economy with its global tentacles. And finally, but not least, the fruits and flowers of the manuscript listing enabled the summer house to be the locus of interpretation of uses of the natural world and contemporary investigations of it. Charlton, in this sense, has another claim to fame as one of the last places of sojourn for the Italian humanist Giacomo Castelvetro, gardener and writer of the manuscript, which he wrote at Charlton, The Fruits and Flowers of Italy. But that's another story. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Many thanks, Sarah, for a fascinating and literally mouth-watering insight, not only into this historic manuscript, but also its architectural, social, culinary context, and also your ongoing research process of trying to make sense of it, and then particularly thinking about how it could be used in a congenial setting like the summer house. So many thanks for this. Now the floor is open for questions. We can perhaps go a tiny little bit over time if that is possible. And while people are collecting their thoughts, maybe Sarah, can I just ask a couple of starting off questions in the sense of, one, I'm always intrigued by taste and by how these kind of things might have possibly appealed to the senses. So do you think this is mainly a decorative, visual kind of experience, or do you think this is very, very acutely sort of geared towards people actually having a essential taste experience? And the other one, quickly perhaps, is this an aristocratic preserve? Could you find that possibly something like that, such a banquet on a smaller scale, maybe in a London merchant context, or is that, reserved for the courtly groups in society?
So the first question, I mean, it's undoubtedly, it is about, taste as well as taste in the aesthetic sense of, the word. These are all very highly flavored sweetmeats. The use of ambergris and musk, and obviously musk is a smell as well as a flavor, is pronounced, as well as, obviously, if you think about those spice oils, as it were, those have a taste as well as odor. And of course, the roots of this, and they're not so deep, although the claims to them are deep in time, that these are medicinally useful dishes, foodstuffs, creations. They all serve a purpose. They are supposed to be in harmony. They are not supposed to upset your constitution. So that balance is of a following on from probably an extremely rich and protein laden several courses before. You've got this emphasis on the balancing out of your complexion through a variety of means. Now, obviously, I think if we were, if one taste, I don't know if anybody's ever had those little caraway seeds in an Indian restaurant at the end of the meal. I mean, that's a caraway confit. And you're provided those as a sort of cleanser and a digestive to settle your stomach, so that it is multisensory, and we don't even know anything about whether there was ever music, but about music that might have been played, the nature of the conversation, the light levels, that it's an incredibly stimulating atmosphere. So the second one, yes, there is a if you like a demotic traveling of this sort of material. So obviously we see it being reproduced in later 17th century printed recipe books, which are intended for a much more mercantile, middling audience. And the best example I can give you of this is, of course, dear old Hannah Woolley in the Queen-like Closet, where she reproduces this astonishing sort of Baroque sugar sculpture that is supposed to be a centerpiece for a banquet. But her basic line is, if you make it yourself rather than go to the confectioner, you're going to save money. And it's bits of rock candy, it's comfits, it's so it is within the reach by the 1660s of her sort of reader.
Great, thank you very much. We have the next question from Evelina Sikora. If you can just unmute yourself, please, and maybe ask that question directly. So the floor is yours.
Hi, Evelina.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I have a question, which is it's not a comment, it's more like also a request for advice in a way. It's about analyzing the mentions or descriptions of the, if we are lucky, of descriptions of those sugary foods in the 17th century sources. And usually what is in the literature is something along the line that is about display of wealth and by extension also of power and prestige. And as you know, I work with food in a diplomatic context, and I'm tempted also to say that it's also about friendliness, amicability, maybe good luck and ambience of, I don't know, coziness. And do you think it's going too far, or what kind of evidence could possibly make this kind of assumption granted? And you mentioned the staging, or the interior and or exterior, where the banquet on the meal is being held, that can help to kind of add a bit of a layer or a shading to the analysis. But
yeah. I think, I mean, if you don't know Louise's article, she's really done an amazing survey of not just surviving structures, but also references to surviving structures, and also reference in printed text to, banqueting as a concept, and although she hasn't done the sort of, perhaps you might want to think about doing, sort of what words occur alongside banquet in some of these texts, so a little bit more of a sort of cluster analysis of the frequency of the term. What she shows is I mean, it's elite and exclusive in the sense that, in many of these spaces you cannot fit very many people. They are small. You're not going to have several sittings of a banquet. It is really for the people you want to have that final sort of closure of this food event, your dinner, your feast, and then your banquet. It's really the people that you want to be with as well as impress. So they're not mutually exclusive. They are, they can be both about commensality in the the sort of horizontal sense, but they can also be about influence vertically, and also asserting authority or erudition, perhaps more precisely. So I think I think cozy is perhaps not quite the right word, but intimacy and the importance of intimacy as a tool of power in Jacobean and Elizabethan and Caroline courtly life is absolutely crucial. So if we think about intimacy rather than coziness, which all sounds a bit middle class, then I think that's where you can find that sort of crossover. You are intimate with the people you trust most, or you wish to who you wish to influence most. That helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Rebecca Earle.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I have a question about the number of guests you might expect at such a banquet, because I'm sure I wasn't the only person who started out as you were on page 1 thinking, oh, that sounds nice, a bit of apricot jelly or, a little confit. That's all, sounds really lovely. And by the end, you were thinking, oh God, this is sort of an exhausting array of sweetmeats, which is often the reaction that one might have to looking at lists of menus. So I was really struck when you were talking about the potential banqueting house or prospect room, and you said it had 6 chairs.
Yeah. Yes.
So I wondered if you could comment on the 6 chairs versus the extensiveness of the banquet menu, and talk about what people would actually eat and what would happen to the food.
Okay, so as I was just saying, these are small spaces, so we're not, I can't think that even, Charlton's summer house is sizable, but once you've put a table in there, once you've put chairs in there, perhaps you've also, at the moment, you might have paneling, you might have textiles. What, statues are not unknown in descriptions of interiors. So, it could be quite a full interior with, probably not more than a dozen people, if you can possibly, because that then defies the sort of intimacy element of it. Now, the nice thing about most of these preparations is that because they involve sugar, as we know, it's a preservative, these things can actually be ladled out of their jars or taken out of their protective boxes in a still room or in a pantry and put back in if they're not eaten, perhaps. So they are quite durable in many respects. Now, I'm not saying that if you were, somebody who wanted to impress somebody, you would reuse your marchpane or your sugar plate sculpture, because that's probably, not done. But the things that you're putting in on your table, those dried suckets and the preserves and the confits, have a bit of a shelf life. And if I can jump ahead in time a little bit, so in Ham House, we see in the 1670s in the inventories for Ham House, in the still house, they have list boxes for sweetmeats, so they are storable. They don't last forever, but they are something that you can make in bulk and then bring out small amounts of. But I don't see this as the sort of broken meats that's going to be distributed to the poor at the gate of Charlton.
Great. Next we have Megan Cable, please.
Oh, Megan, are you going to correct me on my facts?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, not at all. Don't worry. That was really great. It's really interesting. I knew it would be. Such an intriguing building and so many stories to unpick. I just wanted to talk to you about a theory that our architect has, who's doing the enabling works, and he thinks that there's a potential mirrored building opposite where that summer house is now, right on the other side of the estate. Do you think that would have been the case, or have you found anywhere else where that is the case, and would it have served the same purpose of private dining? And
I'm really delighted that Charlie is because that's so the one I showed in the penultimate slide, Meg, and I can talk about this with you at greater length. So the Baptist Hicks East banqueting house is mirrored by a West banqueting house, and those both still survive. So it's very common to have paired garden buildings or paired banqueting houses, or garden structures. Sometimes on a mount, so so they might be built up, and the ones at Old Canton House are interesting because they're kind of two levels. So you've got a terraced green plat, and that's what. So I'm just that you've got. It looks like one story, but actually then the ground falls away, and on the other side you've got it actually is 2 stories. So I'll show you that. But that's really exciting that he thinks there is the footprint of another building, because that would make absolute sense for and possibly make the idea that it's as late as Ducey a bit unlikely.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, and the last question for the moment I have on the list is Daniel Gettings.
Hello, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I wanted to ask a question on drinks, if I may. So, as you say, these sugared sweets are sort of designed as a digestive aid, but I just wondered, because you didn't mention them, whether there were perhaps any specific... I just wondered if in that particular volume there are some sweet drinks that are specifically suggested to be prepared with this, or whether it's more of the same, the wine from dinner.
No, it's definitely, there are recipes for Hippocras, which is a dare I say it, classic banqueting drink. So spiced, alcoholic. It's not, it's very particular taste if you've ever tasted a modern version of it, but very much in line with that sort of use of spices to stimulate and balance out the senses. There is a section in the manuscript on syrups as well, so syrup of violets, syrup of roses. They're not specifically alcoholic, and there isn't a section on what we would now recognize perhaps as alcoholic cordial waters, your liqueurs, as it were. There isn't a section on those in the manuscript. But those may also have been, some of those I've seen as suggested as suitable for again, because they are digestive, because they have that quasi medicinal function.
Thank you. And Sarah, you spoke about student involvement in your plans. How exactly do you see that working in practice?
I had one student who actually transcribed with some help this section, and we'd like to do more. We have various students who are doing other projects with Meg and Carolyn at Charlton on various aspects of the history. It's got some amazing Jacobean interiors, fixtures, as well as interesting histories from other periods. But I think as Meg mentioned, the enabling works that have been funded, and Charlie McKeith, the architect, his heritage architect in Bold, has done a lot of work. So it'd be really nice to sort of put something together in order to perhaps facilitate thinking about, without having to spend an enormous amount of money, what could you do with material like this? By no means am I proposing that this sort of banquet took place in that space. That's not what we're suggesting, but it is very much like the sort of meal could have taken place there.
Great. I think we just seem to have reached the end of our allocated time. It remains for me to warmly thank Sarah for speaking to us, for bringing this, manuscript to life. I would also like to thank Serin Quinn for running the session behind the scenes, and Sue Gibson and Claire Barrett for the general preparation of the event. Our next webinar will take the form of a roundtable discussion on rising global food prices in the afternoon of Thursday, the 25th of November 2018. 2021. So I hope you can join us again on this occasion. Thanks to everybody who joined in. Thanks to everybody who asked a question. Have a good evening. Feel inspired maybe by the banquet to do a bit more ambitious cooking tonight. And I hope to see you at the next webinar or perhaps one of our feast events for Coventry City of Culture. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.